Hey everybody, Timothy here. Welcome to the second part of our split second set review series for Core Set 2019. This is a series where I'm going to review every single card in the set, common, uncommon, rare, and mythic rare, but only give one or two sentences to explain rather than a full in-depth explanation of every single card in the set, mostly to save time so people have an idea of what to expect from the cards for draft and for their pre-releases. So, with all that being said, welcome in, and let's go and start our split-second review for the red cards in Core Set 2019. Alpine Moon is here basically for modern Tron decks and for Legacy and Vintage to some extent, maybe Standard, but it's definitely not a limited card. It is the weirdest way you can possibly fix your mana, but you're not playing this, and you probably shouldn't take it at all, to be honest. Apex of Power costs 10 mana, which is absurd for a core set. They're just not built to get up to 10 mana, but there are some ramp decks in the format, and I might eat my words on this one. I don't see it being playable, but I'll look back at the format here in a month or so and see whether the ramp decks can really take advantage of Apex of Power. Oh, you know that phrase, whoever smelt it, dealt it? That only applies to artifacts, and it should be relegated to your sideboard until you see a couple of those from the opponent. Crash Through is the type of card that never really does too much. It is playable in a red-blue spells-based deck since it cantrips, and it's decent in the red-green stompy decks, but overall it's a 23rd playable if you need a cantrip, and it's not very good otherwise. Here's another card I might be wrong about. Tectonic Rift destroys a land and stops blockers for the turn, which in an aggressive deck can be a win condition. 4 mana is a lot for this sort of effect, and destroying a land is not what you want at 4 mana. It's uncommon for a reason, though, so I can expect this one to go up in value over time. Alright, Lava Axe is back. Sometimes you lose to this card and it never feels great. Doesn't necessarily mean that Lava Axe is a good card, because it's really not. If you're not affecting the board and not winning with this card, it's not too awesome. But in the spell-based decks or any deck where you can utilize this more than once, I can see it being a playable. Oh boy, here's another one of these cards. These cards, in my opinion, are not very good and probably close to unplayable, but sometimes you get it on turn 1 and it really takes over the game. It's not the type of card I'm looking for, but it is a goblin, which matters in this format, and if you can guarantee you always have it on turn 1, then sure, it's a justifiable card for your 23 cards. Sure Strike is back, and I'll say the same thing about this that I said about Mighty Leap. It's a playable card in an aggressive deck, and it's a decent combat trick, but it's not the type of card you're picking highly, and it usually goes pretty late in the packs. Active Treason is back as well, and these are the type of cards that tend to be valued a little higher than they actually perform. Sometimes it's dead in your hand, and sometimes it wins you the game. If you're the red-black sacrifice deck, then this is the key card for your deck, the number 1 card you want in the deck. So be on the lookout for it there. Otherwise, it's fine in aggressive decks and not particularly good outside of them. Tormented Voice is another card that you can play in a spells-based deck if you want to just filter cards, get instants and sorceries into your graveyard. It's fine, but it's not the type of card you actually need in any deck. I tend to play it as a 23rd playable, but don't pick it very highly either. Flood is a sorcery speed fling effect, which is uncommon in this set and kind of intrigues me why it's uncommon when fling is normally a common in instant speed. But for 1 mana, you can toss your creature to try and end the game. I see it being pretty good in the stompy decks that have big creatures at the top end if you can get your opponent low enough, but sacrificing a creature is a real cost, so if you're not winning the game with this, I would avoid trying to play it at all. Trumpet Blast is back as well, and this is the type of card that can win you games you have no business winning. It's very good in a red-white go-wide strategy deck with tons of tokens or tons of small creatures, and it doesn't do too much in your average deck, so play it if you're the token deck, don't play it if you're another deck. Catalyst Elemental is a new addition to this set. It's a very weak creature, as 2/2 for 3 mana is not very good, but you're using its ability most of the time to take advantage of it. Being able to double ramp you ahead can get a big creature out on board much earlier than expected, and can take over the game. It makes for a pretty poor top deck in the late game, so I'm not too high on this card, but I can see it doing some work in the big stompy decks. Good old 3 mana 4/2 is a card that we see come up quite often. It's never amazing since it usually trades down for 2 drops with 2 power, and there are a decent number of those in this format, but 4 power for 3 mana is a lot. It can punish weak draws from the opponent, and there is a mini theme of 4 power creatures in this set, which I can see the Onakai Ogre fitting in just fine in those decks. Another reprint in Dragon Egg. This fits the dragon theme perfectly, and its creature type matches its name, which is awesome too. It's 3 mana speed bump for the opponent in most decks, and a lot of aggressive decks aren't interested in this, but if you end up being in the sacrifice deck, or if you're a more control and red deck, then Dragon Egg is a card that you're just fine putting in your deck. And lo and behold, Fire Elemental is back as well. So we saw this card in Dominaria, and it wasn't particularly good, oftentimes sat in the sideboard, but this is a core set which is a little bit low power compared to something like Dominaria. So I can see Fire Elemental making the main deck pretty often, but still not a card you want to pick up in the packs very highly. Goblin Trashmaster is our Goblin Lord. There's one Lord in each color, and this one happens to work for Goblins. I'm not saying the sacrifice effect is going to be super relevant, but there are a decent number of Goblins in this set, so if you first pick this, you can build around it, but still not doing too much unless you go very wide with the Goblin. So Trashmaster is a card I could take or leave. I don't think it's a super bomb, but it's also the type of card that's a justifiable first pick. Inferno Hellion might have the coolest art in the set, but I'm not sure it's the coolest card in the set. It is a huge trampler with 7 power for 4 mana, but it does get shuffled back anytime it deals damage or attacks or blocks. So it is a huge liability of basically card disadvantage. If you can take advantage of the amount of power this puts out, then that's great. And it also works with Sarkhan's Unsealing exceptionally well, triggering the second ability, which we'll talk about in a minute. I'm not sure whether this is a great card or just a decent card, but it does seem playable. Goblin Instigator seems like a fantastic card in this format. There are red-white go-wide decks in the format, and there are also red-black sacrifice decks that can take advantage of the multiple bodies. Also, the Goblin creature type matters for a couple other cards in this format. So, similar to Dragon Fodder, but split up a little bit differently, this card is highly playable and one that you should prioritize pretty highly in the packs. The next 3 cards are all fairly interchangeable, with Hostile Minotaur making it lowest on the list because he has a derpy face in the art. 4 mana, 3/3 haste is just a simple creature that aggressive decks will play, but not one that you're clamoring to pick up. Next up is Havoc Devils, which is a 4-power trampler for 4 mana. Just fine creature, nothing wrong with it. 4-power trample is probably better than 3-power haste when it comes to your 4-drop, but you'll play this in your stompy decks, and you'll sometimes play it in your aggro decks. It is the type of card that picks up combat tricks and equipment very well, though. And similarly, we have Boggart Brute, which I consider the best of the last 3 cards. 3 mana for 3 power of menace is just fine in your aggressive decks, and it's another creature that can pick up combat tricks very well and punish slow starts from an opponent. Guttersnipe is back at Uncommon here. This is the crux of a blue-red spells-based deck. This and Enigma Drake are basically the cards that make that deck work, so if you find yourself going blue-red, then Guttersnipe is the card you're looking for. Spellcast is intriguing as an uncommon. Normally you'd see this type of card at rare. The reason it's farther down my list than you might expect is because sometimes it's the only spell in your hand and it won't do anything there, but also sometimes I can see people casting double cast into a removal spell or a lava axe and just finishing the game out of nowhere. Fiery Finish is the type of removal spell you get when the premium removal is already taken up in a pack. It's kind of a shame this is uncommon since it is a 6 mana sorcery speed removal spell, but it'll do the trick if you can't get some of the more efficient removal spells in red. Shock is back. Shock is just a fine card, a little bit overrated by a lot of people, but tends to be a pretty playable card in most formats. It will get you through the early game and deal with some pesky small creatures, but it's not a premium removal spell by any chance. It's just a decent card overall. Interesting to see a Planeswalker this low on the list, but Sarkhan leans a little bit too strongly into the dragon theme for it to fit into most decks. At the very least, it is a card filtering machine with its +1 ability, so it gives red something that it normally doesn't have access to, and for that, I think Sarkhan deserves this spot on the list, but it can't be higher unless you're completely dedicated to dragons, which I just don't see that deck coming together too often. Sparktongue Dragon is a Dominaria card that got moved into M19. Think of this like a kicker card. If you cast it for 5 mana, you get a decent flyer, but if you draw it when you happen to have 8 mana, it's going to come down with its kicker ability and deal 3 damage to something. Seems like a very good card to me for a common, and has the fallback of being just a decent flyer at the very least. Here's one that is interesting to me, but I'm not exactly sure how good it is. 5 mana for a 6 power trampler is a lot, but it only gets 3 toughness, so it fails in that department. However, it also gets the activated ability to stop profitable blocks for the opponent. I see this card doing a lot of work, but it is the type of card that might lower in my estimations as time goes on. Here's the red version of the cycle of horses in the format. It can't be countered, it has pseudo-evasion against blue creatures, and it has a pump spell, and even though it has 1 toughness, which I think is going to be a liability in this format, it puts out a lot of damage for a 2-drop, which is something that aggressive decks are always looking for. Alright, now we've got a 2-mana 2/2, a bear with upside, and it has very massive upside. If you can play this in the sacrifice deck and recur a creature or make expendable bodies, this is a huge way to get card advantage in the red-black decks. Also, it works fantastically with Active Treason if you can take an opponent's creature and sacrifice it, plus get a playable card off that. That's a game-winning strategy right there. I'm looking to first pick this card and draft around it. The Ashino Pyromancer is possibly the most annoying common in the set. Even if you deal with it, it's a bear at the very least, so it probably traded off with something, and it always gets that 2 damage in, almost as though it had unblockable haste, even though it doesn't. I think this card is just solid and possibly red's best common outside of some of the removal spells. Sarkhan's Unsealing is a card I talked about in my build-around video, and I think it's absolutely absurd if you can get it going. It's not at the top of the list because it does require a little bit of build-around, and sometimes it'll sit on the board and you just don't have the creatures to trigger it. If you ever trigger the second ability, you probably just win the game, and if you trigger the first ability multiple times, well, that's still probably enough to win the game. I think this card is worth first picking and building around, and I think it might be one of the surprise bomb rares of the set. Now here's a card that pays you off for drafting a lot of goblins. I like this a little bit better than the Lord since it's often going to remove an opponent's creature and something relevant at that. It's essentially Flametongue Kavu if you get a bunch of goblins in your deck, and it is one of the ways in the format to punish the 1 and 2 toughness creatures that your opponent might be slinging around. Electrifies back to get us through the middle part of the game in our aggressive decks. It's also very good in controlling decks, and it is the type of card that any red deck will be happy to play and pick up early. It is a huge sign if you see an Electrify late in the draft, so be on the lookout for it early and pick it up whenever you get the chance. And that leads us to Volcanic Dragon, one of the most annoying cards in the format. It's the type of card that when you're playing against an aggro deck, you have your fingers crossed that they don't curve out into this, because usually you stabilize and then boom, there's Volcanic Dragon to sweep up and finish the game for them. It's a very efficient flyer, haste is very annoying on it, and it's often going to get its damage in whether they have a removal spell or not. Red gets another 2-mana 2-power creature in Dismissive Pyromancer, which is an upgrade to Sarkhan in most of the non-dragon-based decks. It's a looter, or rather a rummager, so it's going to filter cards until you don't need to do that anymore, and then it just functions as a removal spell, so very versatile. Card draw, removal, and a creature all in one, exactly what Red is looking for. Hey, Lightning Strike's here, and it's uncommon again, which is exactly where it deserves to be. Possibly Red's most efficient removal spell, and often Red's best card in a set, outside of the rares whenever it's reprinted. I think that's probably true here too, and you'll pick up Lightning Strike very early and be happy when you get one. If Lightning Strike is a great uncommon, then Spitflame is a fantastic rare. It deals 4 damage at instant speed for 3 mana, which is going to take out most of what you want to, and if you can ever play a dragon and get this back to your hand, well, that's basically game over for the opponent. We have a legendary dragon with Lathliss the Dragon Queen. A 6-mana 6/6 flyer is already enough to win the game if the opponent doesn't deal with it right away, but she's got 2 upside abilities. She can pump herself and other dragons, and if you ever trigger the ability by playing another dragon, then you should win the game basically in a turn or 2. You ever have a friend come up to you after losing a game with a look of disgust on their face, and you ask them what went wrong, and they say, well, I got fireballed out of the game? Well, Banefire is the type of card that does that to people. It's an X spell that can deal with creatures, it often deals with players, it's usually uncounterable, and it's very splashable to boot. It's a first pick if ever I saw one, and a card that I'm always happy taking. And the trophy for possibly best red card in the entire set, and possibly the worst name in the entire set, goes to the Demanding Dragon. A 5-mana 5/5 flyer, again, efficient flyer, is going to win you the game if it goes unanswered, but this one comes down and has upside. Either it kills an opponent's creature, or it makes them take 5, almost as if the dragon has Haste, even though it doesn't. I think this is possibly one of the best cards in the set, and almost definitely Red's best rare in the set. And that's going to cover all of the red cards for us. Let me know what you think of the evaluations. Of course, they're a little bit short and to the point. That's the whole point of these videos. But if you want me to give you an in-depth explanation about any of the cards here or why I think a certain card is better or worse than another, let me know in the comments below and I'll give you a more in-depth explanation. But for now, that's going to cover our split-second review of all of the red cards in Core Set 2019. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe here on YouTube at Mana Rocks, and go to Twitter and I guess follow us or tweet us at MTG_Mana Rocks. Well, thanks for joining me. We'll have more videos out throughout this week until we're finished with the core set. Appreciate you spending your time with Mana Rocks, and we'll see you next time.